One of the questions in the technical side is what is the kind of DAW that we should use? It does not matter. It does not matter what kind of DAW I use as long as uh, the results are audible and they are clean and they are good in quality. You could use Logic, you could use Nuendo, you could use Pro Tools, you could use any other software for sound design. But I would recommend Pro Tools because it is not always possible to, because the huge volume of data, I prefer to work on Pro Tools because there is a certain level of compatibility between my studio and the studio I'm going to be mixing it in, or the music is recorded in a studio which has Pro Tools, so I just have to open the files. I don't have to, reinvent the wheel. Or there's a lot of international compatibility also because sometimes tracks come from outside or we send our tracks outside. So if somebody is doing the mix in US or in Australia, like one of the mixes of one of my films, Eklavya, was mixed in Australia. So I just carried my drive and I plugged it in. I informed them about what are the plugins that I have used. I gave them send them a copy of the session, mailed them the copy of the session. So by the time I reached Australia, he already had the set of plugins that I was using and he already knew what my session was going to look like. So then I just plugged it in over there and it played. So Pro Tools has a compatibility factor, and also because it's far more flexible in terms of audio, far more flexible as a sound, as an audio machine rather than a music based workstation like the Logic or the Nuendo, because the functions of audio are far more friendlier in the Pro Tools. It's a common platform for most of us. Like when we are walking into any particular studio, then the Pro Tools is just the next obvious thing that you're going to be working on. So that's why more out of compatibility and of course quality. I love the quality of that and the flexibility of the Pro Tools, and today the integration of the Pro Tools with Dolby to create Atmos. So all these factors are there when I'm working on a workstation. Of course, you can use any workstation to do that, but to handle the volume of data for a film console, I would always recommend you to use the Pro Tools. That for me is number one. And otherwise, what you can do is whatever you're working on, suppose you're composing on the Nuendo or you're doing your sound design on the Nuendo or the Logic, then what happens is you have to transfer all that, you have to make wave files of all that and then bring it to the sound studio. This is a huge time consuming process, because what happens is when you do all those bounces, it takes an X amount of time, and then when you bring it to the studio, then loading all those, then putting it in timelines, all that takes a lot of time. So if you're working on a compatible workstation, then the uh, the compatibility factor is not there, and then you spend a lot of time kind of working around the mechanics of it rather than going straight to the program. So for me, Pro Tools is something which I always use, and I find myself very comfortable in doing that because it makes me compatible with the dubbing studio, with the music studio, with the effects studio, with the Foley studio, and with the mixing theater. So my studio is compatible with everybody. I just have to make sure that I have the same, that the mix studio has the same kind of plugins that I have, because I do a lot of the mixes myself before I take it into the mix studio. So around 75-80% of the mix is done at my end. And then we progress to the final mix in the mix studio. Another technical question is about headroom, whether it's music, whether it's anything, that you need to have a certain headroom. Now, what I do is when the tracks come to me, I first of all see the overall level of the tracks. If I find the levels too hot or too loud, then what I do is I reduce the levels. I reduce, like suppose from 0 dB, I will reduce it, drop it down to say minus 10, and I start working over there, because then what happens is if I reduce the basic level of the tracks, then I know that the more I keep processing, like adding EQ, adding compression, adding reverbs, adding delays, all these are going to be contributing to the volume, the eventual volume. So in every track. So I kind of make sure that when I'm mixing a song, I always start, we all do, like say from the bass and from the drums and the bass and the percussions, and then slowly like when you're building a wall, you first dig the you first create a foundation. You dig a trench and then you start filling the foundation, creating a foundation on which the wall is going to stand. So that foundation has to be thick and secure and strong so that the rest of the wall can stand on it. Now, the song is pretty much that. So the lower elements, the punchy elements and things like that are the drums and the percussions and the bass. I take a lot of time in trying to first get that right, because then comes the other layers of music all the way up to the vocals. So when you're so Headroom is something that I would start first of all before employing things like compressors, limiters, and before going into mastering and things like that. From my end, I have to make sure that the overall levels of the mix are in place, and then finally, put in compressors and limiters in the final stage of the master, where you can tweak or reduce the overall level and the tonality of that particular song. So it is very important to know that when you're starting a project, when you're starting a song, you have to have an idea of what this is going to sound like at the end, what the final sound is going to be like. So you have to have a certain idea about that. So when you hear a scratch track or when you hear the song, a rough song, then you automatically start making your notes and you start building it in that way, so that you kind of arrive at a particular point where you start with the lowest element in the song in terms of frequencies to the highest element, like the hi-hats and the high percussions and things like that. So everything in between. And I like to create spaces in terms of frequency. So if there is something, say like an 800 hertz zone, like vocals, then whatever is playing in that 800 hertz, I will slightly reduce those particular frequencies so that I can fit in the vocals. So you have to, with every layer, try and accommodate the frequency of the other layer as well. So if there are two things that are playing in a mid kind of a frequency, then you have to enhance the quality, the timbral quality of that particular instrument vis-a-vis their frequency range. So to accommodate a particular frequency, you have to create that particular space, or you have to boost a particular frequency in order to fill in a space which is like a little empty in the bandwidth. So these permutations and combinations is something that you will automatically get. If I'm talking about vocals, then you have to understand that the vocals come in a low-mid kind of a range, and in the instruments that are accompanying in the low-mid can, if they are not interfering with the voice, it's fine. If they are, then you can just cut, instead of dropping the level of that particular instrument, you can just probably duck that particular frequency of that which is interfering with the vocals. Similarly with other solo instruments, like if you're playing a lead guitar, then you could probably duck the other high elements which are probably interfering with the high phrases of the lead guitar. So this is an intelligent and an aesthetic judgment that you have to sit and make. In order to get all this right, you must first understand that you have to standardize your monitoring level, which is around 85 decibels. So at 85 decibels, what happens is most of the frequencies, from the high frequencies to the lower frequencies, they more or less sound the same in terms of there is a uniformity amongst all the frequency, and that only happens at around the 85 decibel range. Because if you mix at a very high level, then your highs are exaggerated, your lows are exaggerated. If you mix at a very soft volume, then you're not hearing the energy of the highs and the lows drop. So that is not giving you a correct judgment. So you have to understand and somehow measure and around 85 decibels with SPL meter, and try and stick to that. And the more you start working on that, you will realize that when you're mixing a song or even a film, don't mix at a very high monitoring rate. Then what happens is, if it is played in a soft level, then all your punch and those kind of things tend to vanish. And don't play it at such a soft level that when you hear it at a normal level, then you find it too sharp or too bass heavy or too mid heavy. So it is very important to understand that to achieve that, your monitoring level has to be a decent monitoring level, which is usually around 85 decibels. Another question was, how do I clean the dialogue clips? Well, we are using softwares like Isotope. Isotope is RX7 Isotope. I've got the Isotope Everything bundle, which is a very nice software to reduce voice. Now, in plain terms, I would say it is not really a noise gate. It is a software that studies what you feed it as noise. Suppose there's a hum, and if you tell the software that this hum is actually noise, can you reduce it for me? So the software will precisely take that hum and almost reduce it to zero from the dialogue. So it could be some kind of a crackle, it could be some hiss, it could be some hum. So you have to tell that particular software and you have to set the parameters. That is very critical. So it should not interfere with your speech. ऐसा नहीं हो कि your word gets cut because of the way you set the noise reduction software parameters. So you have to understand the parameters, what is the threshold that you should select, what are the frequencies that are likely to get masked so you can enhance those particular frequency, what are the frequencies that are likely to get boosted, you have to reduce those particular frequencies. So it's a very, very critical and a specialized job. You have to hear each and every dialogue and you have to make the software understand what is noise and what is not. It should not think that the dialogue is noise, otherwise it will clean out the dialogue. Now that is something which you don't want. So this is how you take clips and you start removing those particular noises. Or many a times what happens is that it is not possible to eliminate that particular noise because it is interfering with the dialogues. And sometimes you want that noise. So what happens is, to cover the noise which is there in the dialogue, you add a little more noise so that the noise in the dialogue does not jump out a lot. Because people are conditioned to a bass noise level. So the dialogue passes off. So these are situations which you tackle as and when you come to them. Sometimes it happens that it's a noisy dialogue, the actor is not available for dubbing. So you have to use this particular dialogue which is there. So you try your best to get the cleanest or the optimum audio quality out of that. So these are things that we need to do. But at the same time, when you're adding noise to mask another noise, it should not be that it becomes very noisy. So you have to be constantly careful and aware of how you're treating that particular sequence. So this is how we work in terms of cleaning the clips and of noise. A lot of people have asked me about VSTs that are being used. VSTs, it depends whether you're using Omnisphere, whether you're using whatever. Those are samples that are being used and usually the musicians use it. I don't use those VSTs. I didn't need to. But there are certain musical sounds which I like to use and which either are there in certain sound libraries which you can sound VSTs which you can MIDI trigger from a small basic keyboard for a particular desired effect. But usually I have not really gone into that because I have certain musical samples which I use, like whooshes, certain dramatic effects. But when you're using these dramatic effects, you have to make sure that you are not generating any kind of a musical note, because it will interfere with what the composer is composing. So you have to be careful as to what kind of notes, or if suppose you know what the composer is composing and you want to use a particular effect like a blast or a bang, which has or a drone which has a particular musical note to it, make sure that that particular note is in the same scale as what the background score is. So it is therefore essential to understand music. So you know that, okay, this is a musical effect. If I use this musical effect, it should not clash with the musical score, but in fact add to it, or be constantly in the same scale would mean like it will not sound irritating or it will not sound odd. So you have to understand that. I think by now I might have addressed most of the issues in the design concept, but there are a few general kind of questions that have I been inspired by people like Walter Murch and uh, these guys. But to tell you very frankly, I mean, it's interesting to know what these guys have done. I've only seen the films that they have worked on. I've not really gone about the way of doing it, because I have found that it's not, I'm not boasting, or I'm not trying to sound like some heavy duty guy from Hollywood or anything of that sort, but our approach is very similar. The way you would think, the way I would design the thing, I didn't find anything different from a lot of European films or American cinema or uh, cinema around the world. And when later on I dug into their interviews and saw the way they approach their approach and the working, it's very mm, it's not it's not at all very different from what I do. In fact, in one of the recent films that I worked on called Shikara, the director Vinod Chopra wanted an engineer from Disney to come and mix the film. But when he came and he started mixing the film, he was very happy with the design. And he just kind of glossed over it. He didn't have to add or take away anything from that. He was brilliant, and he turned around and told me, "Boss, I mean, this is a fantastic design that you have done." And at another time, there's this gentleman called Larry Blake, who is a mix engineer for most of Soderbergh's films, including Ocean's 11 and the series. He had come visiting once to Mumbai, and then he came to my studio. He looked at my, he asked me, "Can you show me your session?" So I opened one of the sessions of one of the films that I was working on, and he went through it, and he said, "This is exactly how we work." So actually having a workstation, the style of functioning or the way of working or the discipline of working has evolved more or less on its own all over the world, and they are all very similar. So if you're composing music, or if you're producing music, or if you're designing sound, the way you would do it and the way somebody in the West or in Europe or in America would do it will not be very different. Because the way the software is designed, the way the architecture of that particular workstation is designed, it'll automatically throw us on the same page in terms of how to exploit it. So that is one thing which I found. So there is a lot of similarity in terms of thinking as to how we would get this particular effect and how I would want to create that particular effect. So when you're when you're reading about these guys, then you realize that, yeah, this is something that I do anyways. This is something that most of us do, not just me, but many of the good sound designers in Bombay as well. They pretty much follow the same kind of procedure that most of these guys do abroad. And another thing which somebody asked me was about Salaam Bombay and Irfan's first film. Now, something very interesting in that film, I was in the unit, I was in the sound unit. I was assisting an American sound production sound recordist called Mr. Yuan Rodriguez. He was from LA. And I was assisting in that. And I have also played a small part, a small role where Meera Nair had told me, "Just put down the microphone and come, and I need you for a particular scene." So there is a scene where there's a guy who's taking Sanjana Kapoor to meet Nana Patekar, and that guy was me. So that is my thing in Salaam Bombay. I didn't know Irfan that well. I think nobody knew Irfan at that point. It was a small yet important role. And later, of course, we worked together in Piku, Irfan and we worked in Piku, and then in Bajirao Mastani, the first voiceover, when Sanjay Bansali was wondering, we need to have a particular voice which is introducing, which comes in the starting of the film. And then I kind of suggested to Sanjay that why can't we have Irfan's voice over there? So he said, it's fantastic. So Irfan was shooting in Rajasthan at that point. And then we sent somebody with a recorder and made him record that voiceover that we were wanting to put in the film. And we brought it, and it was sent back to us, and we put it over there. So that was another very interesting scene with Irfan. I have tried to address most of the questions, and I have tried to combine as much as possible and fit it into this capsule. And thank you, Aditya, for giving me this opportunity to reach out and share my experiences with a lot of people. And for those of you who are starting, this is a fantastic profession, and the more the merrier, and wish you all the best.